Good morning, everyone. My name is Deepti Chobe, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Non-Proliferation Program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I want to welcome you here this morning, where we are honored to co-host with the British American Security Information Council, also known as BASIC, this distinguished delegation that will provide British parliamentary perspectives on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. They are convened under the auspices of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Global Security and Non-Proliferation. And what this means is that they are drawn from all parties in Parliament and from both houses. I think with our current political climate here in the United States, we may have something to learn from them about how to work together with people we may not necessarily agree with. So today, I think it's clear that the United Kingdom has demonstrated tremendous leadership in the areas of non-proliferation and disarmament. For instance, its top leaders have mobilized on this agenda. Carnegie was very honored to host then Foreign Secretary Margaret Beckett in 2007 at the Carnegie Non-Proliferation Conference when she announced re-energizing this agenda and asking for nuclear weapon state leadership on disarmament and non-proliferation. So in that way, this visit from our parliamentarians is a perfect complement to Carnegie's efforts to support disarmament and non-proliferation, and where we offer a platform for key states to shape current debates. And I, for one, believe that if America wants to lead, we need to listen. And I think this is a perfect opportunity to hear from important people on some of the lessons that they've learned in the British debates on the future of nuclear weapons. And I think this will be a great opportunity for us to all engage with them. So what I'd like to do is some short introductions of our panelists and then talk about the format for today's event. We'll start with, on my immediate right is Tony Lloyd, MP. He is the chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and as such, he also chairs the Parliamentary Committee where the Prime Minister and senior government ministers meet weekly with elected representatives of backbench MPs. He's the leader of the British delegation to the OSCE. He's the joint convener of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Global Security and Non-Proliferation, and he has served as Minister of State in the Foreign Office from 1997 to 1999, and he has been a Member of Parliament for Manchester since 1983. To his right is the Right Honourable Des Brown, MP. He's the convener of the newly created top-level group of British cross-party parliamentarians dedicated to multilateral nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and we really hope to hear him speak for the first time about this group today and what they intend to do. He has served as Defense Secretary from 2006 to 2008 at a time when the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq dominated the political agenda and the decision to replace Britain's fleet of Trident submarines was taken. He also addressed during his time as Defense Secretary the Conference on Disarmament, which was a rather unique undertaking as Defense Secretaries don't normally do that. And after he resigned from the cabinet as Defense Secretary, the Prime Minister appointed him Special Envoy to Sri Lanka in February 2009, and he has been an MP for the Scottish constituency of, and I'm sure I'm going to massacre this, Kilmarnock.
Good.
In Loudon since 1997. And then next to him is David Lord Henning of Chizik, and I believe I got that pronunciation correct. He's currently joint convener of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Global Security and Non-Proliferation with fellow delegation member Tony Lloyd. He also chairs the United Nations Association UK, Britain's leading independent policy authority on the UN with a grassroots membership. Lord Henning, a distinguished career diplomat, notably served as UK ambassador to the European Union and to the United Nations. Following his retirement from the diplomatic service, he was appointed British Special Representative for Cyprus and served as a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change, which submitted its report in December 2004. And last but not least is Dr. David Lidington Mp. He is the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs with responsibility for nuclear non-proliferation issues. Previous parliamentary positions include membership of the Shadow Cabinet and Parliamentary Private Secretary to Shadow Foreign Secretary William Hague when he was leader of the opposition. He has been Conservative MP for Aylesbury since 1992, and before entering Parliament, he was Special Advisor to then Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd. So the format is that we're going to spend about half of our remaining time in an informal discussion amongst the panelists so that they can share their views and we can see where there are areas of commonality and disagreement and lessons that we can learn for the American debate on the future of nuclear weapons. And then we'll turn to audience Q&A. I think these gentlemen are very skilled in being quizzed, and I hope that our audience will step up to the plate and quiz them suitably about their views. And then before we go any further, might I ask that you turn off any cell phones or pagers, things like that happen to, they interfere with our microphones. So with that, let me start off with you, Tony, and ask you, what has motivated this trip across the pond? What do you hope to accomplish?
Okay. I guess, Dipsy, when you start off by saying that we're skilled at being quizzed, what you mean is we're a bunch of politicians and don't believe a word that they're going to say to you. But why are we here? Well, let me speak a little bit personally, but I think my colleagues will nuance what I have to say where they disagree. But I think there is probably a fairly broad-ranging consensus now in modern Britain about this whole process of non-proliferation and disarmament. But let me just say this. For the last 30 years, we've not seen the progress on disarmament that probably most of us would have expected in the late 70s. Now, you can look back at each individual check on that process, and you can say, was that logical, was it not logical? I think most people at any particular point in time would have been surprised had we said we'd make so little progress in those intervening years. That's specifically on disarmament. On the non-proliferation process, David Henning quite rightly reminded me that the 95 review conference did make indefinite the life of the NPT and its review process. So it wouldn't be fair to go back 30 years there. But it is equally true to say that the review conferences more recently have not been huge successes by anybody's imaginings. And I think the other thing I'd want to throw into the debate would be this, is that in my country, and I think possibly in the States as well, there's now almost a comfortable acceptance of the reality of nuclear capacity. But we've forgotten that in actual fact simply the existence of these weapon systems does pose risk. It poses risk simply because of its existence. It poses risk around the quantities of fissile materials that are knocking around this globe of ours, not always in secure circumstances. It poses risk because we know now that there are, well, we can say rogue state, if you like, around this world who look to proliferate. And it poses risk because there are groups, possibly Al-Qaeda, but possibly other terrorist groups known or yet to come, who may want to obtain a slice of that action. So the world is a more dangerous place with these weapon systems and the materials relevant on this planet. And we do well to remind ourselves that there is risk in that process. Now, I suppose the other thing to say is that whilst, and I'll come on to the reasons for measured optimism in a few moments, the certainty is that we live in a period now where the capacity for proliferation may be greater than it's been in the past. We know that North Korea has already tested. We know that the Iranians, well, we don't know actually what the Iranians' ambitions are, but we have reasonable reasons for caution. That Iran is in the process of developing a weapons program and not simply a civil nuclear power. So if either of those countries continue along that path, we also know that there will be pressures in those regions for serious proliferation. So we live in an era when both the inherent risk of nuclear weapons and the capacity for proliferation of those weapons is now higher than in the recent past. So what are the reasons for optimism? Well, in the UK, you made the point that Margaret Beckett made, actually a speech that surprised, I must say to this audience quite frankly, when people read what she'd said here. Back in the UK, many of us, our little hearts leapt with a degree of joy that Margaret Beckett was saying very publicly and very powerfully things that many of us wanted to hear our government say. But since then, I think, in fairness, people like Des here, my colleague, but from the UK Prime Minister along, that there is now a consistent message coming through that we want to be part of a process that leads to this interesting concept, a nuclear-free world. Now, but what then, why are we here? We have now a president for the first time for some time who has made a number of very, very significant comments in this area, the Prague speech in particular, but President Obama actually himself using this language of the capacity to move along a pathway to a nuclear-free world is such a dramatic change of the state of play as to be something worthy of examination. Now, I'll begin to conclude my remarks and let my other colleagues come in by saying this, that what are we here for? Well, we're here really to see whether this is just aspirational or whether there is something real in the Obama agenda. Is it something aspirational that a good president, and he's still pretty popular actually on our side of the pond, that a good president wants to put out there as part of the rhetoric of politics, or can he deliver the son of start at the moment with Medvedev? Can he deliver on the CTBT treaty? Can he deliver actually, much more importantly, even beyond that, on defining a pathway through the NPR and other areas on a process that does lead us down a road that takes us maybe far off, but does take us to that nuclear-free world? Now, obviously, we want to talk to the administration. We want to listen to distinguished people like those present here today. Want to talk to those in Congress who are influential either in moving that agenda forward or possibly in restraining that agenda from getting too far ahead of itself. And so, do we go away believing that Britain, with, I think, a bipartisan view that we want to make progress on this agenda, has an America that will give the leadership that we want? Because actually we do need American leadership, but we also, in your point, we want an American leadership that listens to its friends, listens to its allies, listens actually to the world. So is this America really going down that road to the nuclear-free world, and is it going to listen to its friends and partners on that journey?
Great, Tony, thank you. And I think that your comments for me underscore the importance of leadership, and that you need visible leaders who are talking about this agenda, and not only in terms of its vision, but actual steps. So Des, let me turn it over to you and ask you about your top-level group, and if you could give us a little bit more information about what it is and what its purpose is, and how it fits into that.
Well, first of all, Deputy, thank you very much for hosting this event and for giving us this opportunity. I mean, hopefully over the course of this conversation that we're having in this discussion, some differences will arise from people up here to leaven the otherwise repetitive nature of our observations. But there is a remarkable degree of consensus in the UK on these very important issues. I mean, I'm conscious I sit here between the two joint chairs of an all-party group that's been in existence for some particular period of time as the convener, and I use that word rather than the chairman, because if you had any idea the egos that are involved in the group of people whom I'm trying to convene, then you would have some sense of why to call yourself the chair of them would be somewhat presumptuous. Of a fledgling group which has emerged and which holds itself apart from this group for a very specific reason, which I will explain in a moment or two. That group has 16 members. All of them are experienced politicians, and all of them, with I think one exception, and that's a man who was the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party for a short period of time, Mingus Campbell, who will be known to many people here, have held high office in either the foreign policy side or the defence side, and among them have 2 decades really of responsibility for nuclear policy in foreign policy terms and in defence policy terms. There are also 3 former chiefs of staff, 1 who's a Navy man and 2 from the Army. So this is a group of people who have shared a degree of responsibility and of practical experience, and have had the weight, as I held for 2 years, of the responsibility of these awesome weapons at the highest possible level in government. They have come together because there is a growing political momentum in the UK and more broadly across the world, expressed in the way in which my colleague and friend Tony has explained in President Obama's speech, particularly his Prague speech, there is a growing political momentum that the time is right for engagement on these issues. I think most people in this room will know that almost every country in the world has its gang of four who signed a letter. And we were no exception, only it was a Times article. That Times article has now grown into this group of people who want to make a contribution across 3 or 4 areas. One, they want to make a contribution at the level of political leadership to the debate in the United Kingdom, despite the fact that all of these distinguished people who are with me on this group and others are involved, and there are many others who are technically so expert it's frightening on this issue. I've been involved for decades in discussing this issue. It gets very little currency, frankly, in the general political debate, and hasn't done for the best part of 2 decades. In fact, I have a personal view that the detail of these issues is so intimidating for most politicians that they are quite happy to leave it to the experts to have their conferences all over the world discussing these issues and not to get engaged with them, and they feel excluded from them, and I intend to try to move the debate on to the more strategic level so that politicians can be involved. And I confidently expect that in our time here in Washington we will meet a limited number of people who will be able to command at the political level the sort of debate that I can have, or discussion that I can have with people who genuinely are experts, and all the complexity of all of this proliferation, nuclear disarmament, all of these issues which people have been discussing quietly and unnoticed by the political classes for a significant period of time. So we want to get that debate out more into the public domain. I mean, I share this short anecdote with you. I wrote an op-ed piece for the UK broadsheet newspapers, any of them who would take it, about the preparation committee for the review conference for the NPT, just to explain in simple terms how important this group of negotiators who'd been working on this issue quietly for a long time, coming together at this time, was really important to the future security of the world, and we ought not to ignore it. Nobody would take it. Nobody would take it. Why would anybody be interested in this? That having been said, this group now exists. There's a piece in the Manchester Guardian about it today, simply because I'm coming on this particular delegation, and the Guardian were interested in what was going on. But when they saw the names of the people involved in this group, they've written a piece about it. Now that doesn't resolve the problem, and we don't have the debate now that we want to have, but we have the beginnings of it, and we have a hook. And I have on my BlackBerry 4 requests from the BBC. You have to understand that the BBC is such an enormous organisation, they have to interview you 4 times. 4 requests from the BBC to do interviews this evening before the drive time programmes go off. Now, we would never have had that level of interest unless these names were associated with it. So we hope to take advantage of that to broaden the debate in Parliament, both houses of Parliament, and more widely across the political spectrum in the UK. The second thing that we hope to do is that we hope to, for very obvious reasons, which I think we'll come to discuss over the course of this conversation we're having this morning, but I won't go into detail just now, but we hope to bring Europe together. As I say, every country in Europe has its gang of 4, but they're operating broadly separate from each other, so we hope to bring Europe together. And we hope to bring Europe together for another very important reason, because if we can bring Europe together, speaking with a similar voice, then there is every possibility that we will get France engaged in this conversation in the same way as the other P5 powers, to a degree, have indicated that they're prepared to be engaged. And finally, because those people whom I have now joined with have reached into the American political system over decades of relationships, we hope to offer our experience of the last 20 years or thereabouts as evidence to those on the Hill who will need to help to make these decisions for us, to help to provide the leadership that your President wants to give the world, that they can with confidence move down that road, and that you can balance security and disarmament in a way that does not diminish the security of your people or your interests across the world. So I convene a group of people who have significant reach into the American political system because they've worked with senior American politicians for many years, and I offer these people now and will over these days, to senators and others to converse with them, to debate with them, to discuss with them, and to share our advice. Now, I have to say, having brought this group together every day, somebody now brings another item for the shopping list to add to it. And one of them, which I have accepted, is that we are going to try to drive an initiative to repeat or to replicate the Jason initiative in the United Kingdom. There is an absence of independent scientific advice, separate from government or from interested groups in the United Kingdom, and we're going to explore that possibility. So that's what we're about, if that's clear.
Yes, that's great, and I think it's terrific that there's a two-way exchange of experiences and lessons. I am not surprised by your anecdote that newspapers weren't taking up the charge to hear about the MPT preparatory committee meeting, but I think you've touched on this issue of the United Nations and these multilateral negotiations. So, David, if I might ask you, where does the UN really fit into this, and how important is it, not only in terms of the UN Security Council, where we think about them particularly as we try to engage today's proliferation crises like North Korea and Iran, but also just the broader MPT review process and the upcoming conference in May 2010?
Yeah, well, just to talk a little bit about the UN involvement. The UN involvement is not, of course, total. It doesn't cover the whole waterfront. The UN does not have any particular role to play in the negotiations between the United States and Russia on downsizing their nuclear arsenals. But if you look at the whole agenda that we're talking about, the Non-Proliferation Review Conference next year, the dealing with Iran and North Korea, the International Atomic Energy Agency's inspection capacity, which is absolutely critical to the whole of this. If you look at all that and many other things, you'll find that the UN comes into this all the time. So it is very important that the UN, whose disarmament and non-proliferation agenda has also languished for the obvious reason that its principal members have not been very enthusiastic about it, or in some cases, under previous administrations, have actually been very aggressively opposed to it, that this needs to be revived. If this is not just to be a flash in the pan, it's not just to be one speech in Prague. It's got to mobilize an enormously wide range of countries who have very, very different interests in all this. Some of them are nuclear weapon states recognized by everyone, the P5. Some of them are nuclear weapon states who did not sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty and are therefore not broken international law, but are not recognized as such, India, Pakistan, and Israel. Some of them appear to be aspiring by clandestine means to get a nuclear capability, North Korea and Iran. And then there are the 160 or so others who live near to these countries and are distinctly worried and are interested in, for example, can the Security Council provide more what are called negative security assurances about avoiding threats to them from a nuclear power or the risk of getting involved in a nuclear exchange. So this is an issue that touches every country in the world, and in which you do need to mobilize the United Nations and all the different agencies and parts of it. The International Atomic Energy Agency just got a new Director General, is really very crucial to this. They've played a very important role. They were the people who first identified the North Korean breaches of their obligations under the safeguards agreement they had. They are the people who have been closest into the Iranian program, and they are the people who, if they can be empowered with the additional protocol of the IAEA, which gives you a much more intrusive right of inspection, could be the underpinning for a world moving toward towards one free of nuclear weapons. So I think it's important not to overstate the UN's role, because it has weaknesses, it has difficulties in its decision-making capacity, but equally to recognize that you cannot possibly advance this agenda. And it is a tremendous step forward that we're now talking about a really broad agenda, not just individual little technical bits of it, which some particular group in each country is very knowledgeable about, but which the normality and the generality of people in politics and ordinary life simply don't understand what they're talking about. We are now talking about a much, much wider agenda than has been the case for many years. That, I think, is hugely welcome. The question is, can we move that agenda both in the United Nations and outside it to points of decision, to rules-based arrangements from the aspirations which we have at the moment?
Great. And David, I understand that current polls have projected that the Conservative Party may take power at some point in the coming year. If that is actually the case, what will a Conservative Party in power mean for the UK's disarmament and non-proliferation agenda?
Yeah, so our general election is likely to be May, as the time most people are expecting, in which case the NPT review conference, from a British perspective, could be a bit like the Potsdam conference, where one lot of British ministers fly in at the start and are replaced by another set halfway through. But this is an issue on which there is a fair degree of bipartisanship. I mean, there might be, tweaks of policy difference, but our judgment is that it's very much in the national interests of the United Kingdom that the NPT review should be a success and that concrete steps are made to limit and check a nuclear proliferation. William Hague, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who will be Foreign Minister if there is a Cameron government in London, has made a couple of keynote speeches on this, and in the first one, which was in, I think, 2006 or early 2007, I mean, he set out very clearly a number of policy objectives for 2010. Those would include some kind of automatic referral for breaches of NPT commitments or threats to leave the NPT direct to the UN Security Council, so that the mechanism existed for rapid response by the Security Council to any such breach or threatened breach. Secondly, he argued for a strengthening of the regime administered by the IAEA, and in particular for the additional protocol to be made mandatory for all signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Third, we've called for tougher rules on the transport and the physical security of nuclear materials. And fourthly, for even stronger action and more effective monitoring than we have at present about the financing of proliferation activity. We've argued, too, for more effective international action and solidarity than has been possible hitherto regarding both Iran and North Korea, which we may want to discuss in greater detail later on. I think that we're absolutely committed to making a success of the review. It's fairly obvious to me that if you're going to stand a chance of getting India, Pakistan, Israel to come into some framework of control, of international control, then the existing nuclear powers have got to show that they're serious about their obligations under the treaty to engage seriously in multilateral disarmament. And we buy also into what's been stated by the gangs of four around the world, that there is intrinsic merit in this. I remember sitting in a meeting at the House of Commons of the all-party group and hearing George Shultz and Sam Nunn, than whom there can be few with more impeccable hawkish credentials, say, this is a necessary move in order to reduce the risk of an unintended conflict between the United States and Russia. The arguments, a case I found very persuasive indeed. We take the view that the nuclear-free world, yes, we will sign up to that as an objective, but we're not starry-eyed about this being quick or easy. It does provide a policy framework, a final destination within which you can set clearer and perhaps more practical objectives. I mean, when General Slim was appointed to command the British Army in Burma for the nadir of the war against the Japanese, I mean, this army had been in retreat for a year, and he said, we're not simply going to, of course we're going to defeat the Japanese, but we're going to set ourselves attainable objectives. In the meantime, we're going to capture this hill, we're going to capture that fuel depot. And I think if we want to get to the nuclear-free destination, we actually have to look at this as a series of attainable, benchmarked objectives along the way.
Great. So far, I haven't really heard any disagreement amongst the four of you, unless I'm wrong, but I think...
We're being very good.
Yes, you've been very good. So let me open up an issue then where there might be some disagreement, and that's on the issue of modernization. We know that the United Kingdom, through its Trident debate, had a very public conversation about it in debate, and I think that's an aspiration for many of us as Americans that we would have that same level of public engagement here in the United States. As we are going through our process of a nuclear posture review, which I guess now it's intended to be concluded in February of 2010, what are the lessons, what lessons do you think Americans should draw from the debate that you've had in the United Kingdom on Trident? And I'd love it if Des would jump in, or if any of the rest of you want to comment first.
Well, I suppose I should reassume responsibility for this, since I had responsibility for it and led the debate, I think, in the United Kingdom. I think there are people in this room who were dissatisfied with the outcome of that debate. I don't think I can say that confidently, and there are people who would have welcomed even more openness, but I'm proud of the fact that we were more transparent than any other government ever has been, and broadly speaking, apart from some very clear red lines about our national security, I was prepared to put anything that assisted the debate into the public domain, and put a lot of information that had never before been put into the public domain. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make, of course, is that you have to understand that that happened in the context, albeit disjointed from other steps that had been taken, but in the context of a progression of disarmament in the United Kingdom since the end of the Cold War. I mean, we have 75% fewer warheads than we did at the end of the Cold War now. And no matter how you define them, whether you're talking about deployed or deployable or whatever, I mean, we have substantially fewer, 75% fewer than we did then. We had two weapon systems. We now only have one weapon system. And we have a continuing debate in the United Kingdom about what minimalism really means. What is a minimum deterrent? What is if you sign up to the concept of deterrence, which we do in government, and in a bilateral sense we do across Parliament, although there are very strong alternative voices, there's no question about that in our Parliament, which are accommodated in the debate, but don't win the numerical vote. But we have a constant debate about what is the minimum deterrent that is necessary. And you can expect, I think, with some confidence that that debate will open up again in the United Kingdom, in the context of the public supervision, as it were, of the process of contracting for and building the next generation of boats as platforms to support the Trident system. Because we gave an undertaking as government during the course of that debate that we would subject that process to public and parliamentary scrutiny. And I will, from the backbenches, ensure that my colleagues in government maintain that commitment which I gave, that debate will take place. But at the same time, and those watchers of this subject, this was not lost on them, we also had a strategy to live up to another undertaking, which was that we would engage in the leadership of, I think it would be conceited now to say that we're leading this debate, but the debate about multilateral disarmament across the world. And that's why Margaret Beckett came here, I mean, that was part of a strategy that we agreed across government. I was in government with her. That's why she came here to your conference and made the speech that she did. That's why I'm still the one and only Defence Minister ever to address the Commission on Disarmament in Geneva, and that speech was part of that strategic approach. The subsequent speeches that Prime Minister Gordon Brown, that David Miliband have made, and other practical measures that we have taken are all part of that planned strategy, that roadmap, that incremental approach to this process. I mean, for example, I offered that Britain would host a confidence-building conference of P5 delegations, and it took place. Not to a lot of fanfare, but it was concluded in London on the 2nd and 3rd of September. It has taken place. I mean, my understanding is that it was a very positive event, and that there were surprising contributions from surprising quarters in terms of those discussions, which are not going to be reported publicly for very obvious reasons, because they're about building confidence among the P5 first of all. But the communique at the end of it, I am told by those who were present at the meeting, represented the positive nature of the discussions, and I accept that from people whom I know and worked with in government. So that has taken place. At Aldermaston we are doing, particularly with the Norwegians, some very difficult technical work about verification of disarmament in order not to breach the NPT provisions, so that non-nuclear weapon states can have confidence in it without a breach of the NPT, and we've made a lot of progress. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, because I'm sorry, Deputy, I forgot about the question once. But it's what I wanted to say anyway.
Yeah. So, I think you can be forgiven that if I'm asking you a question about Trident that you forgot the question, so it's okay. But that said, Tony, I know that you wanted to jump in on this and offer a view.
Sure. Actually, this does not contradict, it supplements, I think, what Des has been saying. Des made 2 points in his different contributions. One was his anecdote about the inability to get this debate into the wider public domain in the UK. And I think that we have something of the same in the States as well, that this is a bit of an argument for those who wear... Do you have anoraks in the States? I'm not quite sure. We call these people who engage in things like train spotting anoraks, and therefore those who engage in any area of intense technical concern like this are anoraks in the UK. So the anoraks, Des and others,
I don't consider myself to be an
this.
anorak, I have to say. It's the first point of disagreement.
He's far too well dressed to be an anorak. I shall have to have this explained. We'll have simultaneous translation. I am. But the point I want to make really was this: is that it is very difficult to get this debate in the broader domain, and even when the Trident review process was taking place, there was no huge public debate at the time in the UK. What may change this, though, I think, a number of things. One that would change and possibly frighten the public in the UK into a much more hawkish position would be breakout in Iran. I think probably less in the UK, frankly, North Korea, but I think Iran could make a serious difference to the public psychology of this debate. This operates in an entirely different direction. You may have noticed that public finances around the world are going to be under some pressure in days and weeks to come. Our, not represented here on this panel, but our third party has already begun to take a rather different tack on Trident renewal than the 2 major parties. The debate around public finances, I saw an opinion poll in the UK yesterday that said that people, I suspect, asked a rather loaded question. Do you want the government to protect spending on health? Do you want, rather controversial in the United States, I suppose, do you want the government to protect public spending on education? Do you want the government to protect public spending on our nuclear capacity? The public actually said yes health, yes education, no nuclear warfare. But of course, these things depend on how you ask the question. All I want to just throw into all this is that we've not had a serious public debate around our nuclear doctrines probably since the mid-80s in the UK. I think that would be fair. We could enter a period when it comes back into mainstream politics, either driven by global dynamic of proliferation, or driven by, in the opposite direction, the perception that this is money that we could spend better elsewhere.
Great. And David, I know you, well, both of you want to jump in, it seems, and then I want to ask a question about doctrine afterwards. So,
well, just a couple of brief points on this from a completely non-party, not bipartisan, non-party point of view. The Trident decision, which was taken and endorsed by Parliament, was taken, of course, before the revival of multilateral nuclear disarmament was really on the scene. And this has been recognised by more recent speeches by Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister, when he said that we will be prepared to participate in any follow-up to the first US-Russian discussions that necessitate the other recognised nuclear powers, France, Britain and China, to get involved. So that has changed, and then there is the point that Tony Lloyd has made about the public finances, which is coming into much sharper focus now, but which of course didn't exist at all at the time that the decision was taken. So it's clear there is going to be a renewed debate. But what is quite interesting, I think, for a non-politician to recognise in Britain now is that the old divide between unilateral disarmers and people who put security first has been greatly, greatly changed. There is now, across the board, I mean, of course, there are unilateral disarmers there still. The campaign for nuclear disarmament is still in existence. But the broad spectrum of British opinion seems to be in favour of this multilateral nuclear disarmament agenda, which President Obama put forward eloquently at Prague, but which, of course, others have put forward. And I think that's why you get on this platform a very wide degree of support for all these measures. And I don't think we're going to slip back straightforwardly into a unilateralist versus security first debate. I don't think that's really terribly likely anymore. And the focus of this debate is going to be the things we're discussing in this room this morning.
Great.
We voted in favour of the government's motion on Trident renewal. Of course, as Des more than anyone will know, I mean, these were decisions because of the lead times involved that had to be taken roughly 20 years before the finished product was due to become available. I mean, the debate has shifted in the way that David Henning has described. I mean, my party's stance will continue to be very firmly in favour of the United Kingdom maintaining an independent nuclear deterrent, and I don't see that position shifting. There is, I think, a debate starting, including amongst some Conservatives, about what the nature of a minimum deterrent should be. I mean, it's obvious that Trident submarines are not going to be much use against non-state actors who manage to get hold of nuclear materials. But if you are talking about a country, a state in the Middle East that developed a nuclear capability and a delivery system, then it would be very relevant indeed to our own security concerns. But I think in terms of public opinion, this debate is being shaped by two other things. One, as Tony Lloyd said, was in the context of the overall concern about the level of public debt, the growing realisation that they're going to have to be very tough budgetary choices facing whoever is in government after the general election. And nuclear missiles are a less, is obviously sexy and attractive option for most voters than hospitals or schools or police officers on the streets. I think also if you look at it in terms of priorities within defence spending, there has been a huge amount of coverage in the British media over the last year about casualties in Afghanistan, about allegations that the British troops there are being asked to carry out missions for which there are not sufficient numbers of troops, there's not sufficient equipment, material available. And I won't sort of get into a partisan sort of knockabout on that on this platform, but that debate is out there. And so then when people start to be asked, well, which is your priority in terms of defence spending? Is it getting more recruits into the infantry and making sure they're properly equipped, or is it buying 2 big aircraft carriers or a new generation of aircraft for the Royal Air Force or Trident modernisation? You find people starting to question some of the expenditure on Trident. So I think that debate will rumble on. I think at the end of the day, whether it's a Conservative government or a Labour government, it will be a very hard-headed judgment about what level of nuclear deterrent do we need for Britain's vital national security interest, and that's where the decision will be taken, on those grounds.
So before I turn you over to our audience for questioning, let me just ask you 2 final questions. One is, I believe, Des, you said that part of this effort is to lead Europe, or perhaps Tony, you said that. Sorry, Des, you said that. Good. The NATO strategic concept debate has been opened and joined, and I'm wondering what your points of view are on how the disarmament and non-proliferation agenda should be reflected in whatever the new NATO strategic concept should look like. And then my second question, and then we'll end there, is, what are the key messages that you want to send to American policymakers who are currently contemplating nuclear debates here in the United States? What direction do we need to be going in? This could be on the issue of doctrine. Is the purpose of nuclear weapons to defend against a wide range of threats, such as chemical, biological, radiological, as well as traditional nuclear formulation? Or is it time for us to come back to that more circumscribed definition of the purpose of nuclear weapons? And you can choose to take either of those, and then so we'll just do a quick fire round, and then we'll move over to the audience. So, Tony, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Can I probably concentrate on the second? Because
sure.
if I said rather unkindly, I'm a little bit of a sceptic about what the role of NATO is in the modern world, unless we totally redefine what NATO is all about. So since Des was a Defence Secretary, I'll leave him to explain.
I'll have a much clearer idea.
Exactly. But I mean, I guess, look, the number of things. First of all, it almost seems to most people think in the UK the idea that nuclear weapons are there as means of deterrence vis-à-vis terrorism is ridiculous. I hope that ought to be a common view. It's pretty nearly the same response in connection with deterrence vis-à-vis biological, chemical, radiological weapons, because it doesn't do the trick. The level of destruction of nuclear weapons is so disproportionate that most of us, I think, would feel that this is not the direction in which we ought to be going there. I know there are kind of arguable points within that. Perhaps we can return to those. I think what I would want to say, though, is that if we're seriously looking at a pathway to this long-term goal of a nuclear-free world, there are some very key components that probably nothing to do immediately with nuclear doctrine per se. It is, for example, like intensification of a peace process in the Middle East. It's inconceivable that we can really persuade Israel to join this process unless Israel has got security guarantees that are so strong that they do feel that the survival of Israel is not under pressure. But I must also say, from an Arab point of view, the same thing applies. If we want non-proliferation in the Arab world with an Iran who is not always greatly loved by its neighbours, then we need to give the whole of that region security. Kashmir becomes absolutely central to this debate. If we're to bring in India and Pakistan, if there is no resolution of the question around Kashmir, then we are, frankly, going to be wasting an awful lot of breath in the years to come. So I suppose what I'm really trying to say within this context is that the debate around nuclear doctrine, in that quite narrow sense that we used to discuss how many missiles, when do you use them, such like, is an important one, and that's got to go ahead. But if we don't recognise that what we're talking about is how do we build a secure world, how do we have the components that are almost nothing to do in some parts of the world, at least seemingly nothing to do with nuclear weapons per se, then we miss a big trick, because we don't provide the basis on which the rest of the world is going to feel comfortable with American leadership. The other thing I suppose I would want to just throw in at this point is that I think we can have a UK to US, a reasonable conversation about a shared aspiration to a world without nuclear weapons. We can have disagreements and agreements, but they're probably going to be in a kind of well-defined, elegant process of debate, because we do tend to speak a common way of thinking, as well as, well, you know, this thing about two nations divided by a common language. But
as demonstrated by Anorak.
Indeed, yeah. I am so sorry. I'm going to send to Carnegie an Anorak, so you'll know what these things are for the future. But I'm not quite sure whether the same ability to have that conversation exists within Moscow, within Beijing, within New Delhi, in Islamabad, in Tel Aviv. And we've got to begin to make sure that or indeed actually in Paris. So within that context, yes, we can talk to each other. Yes, we do want to work with you, for you to take on leadership. Some areas where only you can do it, only Washington and Moscow can look at the immediate steps in disarmament. That's right. But we also do need to embrace and begin to see, what does this process look like if it's from the perspective of those we need in this rather elegant dance to come. And I'm not sure at the moment that I know that this perspective of a nuclear-free world is one that's shared in Moscow or in Tel Aviv, say. It may be, but we'll have to persuade them that we understand the insecurity and deal with those insecurities in terms of other weapon systems.
Great, thank you. And I want to just make sure we don't run out the clock on questions from the audience, so I'll ask the rest of the panelists to give us quick-fire responses.
Well, if you want a quick-fire response to the question about NATO and nuclear weapons, the answer is it's difficult.
Okay.
As NATO is the most successful political military alliance the world has ever known. We ought to do everything we can to preserve this alliance. I mean, it's done a number of things, and in Europe it has been the pathway towards social democracy for a significant number of countries. Now, almost all of those countries that are now members of the European Union and aspire to all the social democratic principles that requires came to that through the gateway of membership in NATO. And it was their aspiration to join NATO that drove their politics to change the way in which they governed their countries, rather than anything else. So apart from anything else, you know, the contribution that is made to the development of social democracy across Europe should never be underestimated, and since that's on our doorstep, you know, we should risk that at our peril. It's easy to become frustrated with an organisation like NATO, which operates on consensus, and those of us who have been involved with it intensely over Afghanistan have every reason to be frustrated about some of the decisions that NATO has made, and we need to be really careful that we take these challenges that are present to NATO at the moment and see them as the forge in which you form the NATO of the 21st century, rather than the anvil in which you break NATO, which is what tends to be said. And we've got to be very careful that we don't create further crises, so that every time there's a NATO meeting, it's NATO in crisis as the headline before the meeting, and that, you know, your president is encouraged to articulate demands for more troops from countries that don't have them, or have troops that are not deployable, as he heads off to some European capital for a NATO meeting. So the handling of NATO is difficult, and you are greatly blessed in that you have Bob Gates as your Defence Secretary, I think, for a number of reasons, I have to say, but he now has significant experience of NATO meetings, and has, to my knowledge, a very wise approach to how NATO can be reformed and reshaped in order to incrementally move towards the sort of alliance we want for the 21st century. But turning specifically to the issue of nuclear weapons, the answer is complex, but it is very simple. And it is with almost everything that you ask this disparate group of countries to engage in. It depends on their national interests, how they will engage and how they will exercise their decision-making in the collective. So, for example, the Turks will have an entirely different attitude than the Germans. But I just say to you with confidence that if the United States of America, in terms of its own review, determines that these weapons which they have deployed across Europe for use, God knows when, actually, and in what circumstances we could legitimately use these or even legally use them. But if they determine that they are surplus now or no longer of relevance to America's interests, to its security, to the security of the world and its allies, or to its extended deterrence, and it approaches individually those countries that it has good, strong bilateral relationships with to explain that to them, then I believe that agreement could be arrived at to that objective. If, however, the Americans disengage from this issue because it is much less important than bigger, wider issues to do with defence or to do with strategic defence, and in fact matters little to America, then we will end up in exactly the same position in 5 or 10 years' time as we're in at the moment. And in order to win that battle for those of us who want to see fewer nuclear weapons in the world, the key to it, as always, is to open up the debate in the countries so that the people of those countries, so that the German people know and understand what is present on their soil, what purpose it serves and why it is there, and make people like Angela Merkel and others debate that internally in their own country. And the same, I think, has to be said about some of those more difficult countries where there is not that relationship mature enough between their government and their people, such as Turkey. But opening up that debate will help to create the environment for the sort of ends that we want. But we need to begin that discussion. And frankly, I just say to you finally, Deputy, I could think with some confidence say that, in my view, the majority of people in Europe don't even know these weapons exist.
Okay. David.
Just answering your question about the role of the United States in our view from Europe, it is an absolutely necessary, essential part of any realistic agenda for multilateral nuclear disarmament. It's not a sufficient answer to every question. It's not just that everyone will fall into line with the United States. But if the United States does not give a lead in this sense, as we saw over the last 8 years, nothing happens. And looking ahead, that's even more certain, because Russia is now much more dependent on its nuclear element of its defense than it ever was in the past, given to the degradation of its conventional resources and its demographic problems. So they're not going to take a lead other than in rhetorical terms, and nor we can be quite sure of the Chinese. Now, finally, the European dimension. Of course, the European Union consists of 25 non-nuclear weapon states and 2 nuclear weapon states. So there are certain built-in differences there. But on the whole, the European Union last December, in fact, it actually managed to communicate to the Secretary-General strong support for the whole disarmament agenda, including the nuclear disarmament agenda. It has been able to find 25 million euros to back, along with Warren Buffett, to back the scheme for a uranium enrichment bank, which would enable civil nuclear users to not be tempted down the road of building new enrichment or reprocessing plants, an extremely important objective for the IAEA. And so I think there is a European dimension to this which is pretty positive, but it has, like the NATO dimension, some inbuilt difficulties about it, but they can be overcome.
Okay. And David, you have the last word before.
I'll try and be very quick. What should the United States do? I mean, it sounds glib, it's almost get on with it. I mean, there are both START and the Test Ban Treaty are things that clearly are decisions primarily for the United States of America, and the NPT review is not going to succeed, as David Haney said, unless there is demonstrable US energy commitment leadership put into it. And I just say 2010 seems to me to be a critical year. What we know for certain is that the globalization of nuclear know-how is going to continue and accelerate. We know that more countries, because of worries about energy security and climate change, are going to turn towards civil nuclear energy with the attendant risks of weapons proliferation that inevitably brings. If 2010 is seen to be a failure because the various non-proliferation disarmament initiatives run into the sand, let alone if that is accompanied by a breakout in Iran or continued successful defiance of the NPT by North Korea, then I think that the lesson which other countries will learn is that the current regime of international controls is ineffective and can be scorned. And that will make us all a lot less safe.
Great. Thank you. So with that, we're going to turn over to the audience, and I have a few people who have been waiting for a bit. So the first question, we're going to take two at a time. The first one goes to you, sir. And if you could please state your name and affiliation and briefly your question, and then, sir, we'll go to you.
My name is Andrew Kerr. I'm now at Georgetown University, but way back in the early 1960s, I was a very junior diplomat at the American Embassy in London following defense issues. So I went through Blue Streak, the end of the British independent deterrent, Skybolt, which Mr. McNamara canceled on the British, the Nassau Agreement, in which very skillfully Harold Macmillan got out of John F. Kennedy's hands the Polaris system and so on, and the debate since then. I think that Britain has moved a long, long ways now in bipartisan way, call it, multi-partisan, in the Trident decision. But I think that raises another question. We're going to have probably successfully a conclusion to the START agreement negotiations at the end of this year, we hope. And that's then going to raise the question of whether the next round of arms control, strategic arms control discussions ought to be truly multilateral, involve the two European nuclear powers. I'd be curious as to what extent you gentlemen, or reflecting views in your country, are thinking at all about a sort of set of negotiations with Russia, which includes your own nuclear weapons, as well as those potentially of the French.
Okay, so we have one question about further multilateral negotiations, and sir, if you can just wait for the microphone, and then we'll...
I'm John Marks from Search for Common Ground. I recognize that Britain currently has a policy of an independent nuclear deterrent, but at the same time, there seems to be a consensus in your country now for nuclear disarmament, and you've chosen to go in a multilateral way. And I know the word unilateral has a history with you that's different than the history in this country. But what I don't understand is why you don't lead by example rather than by getting into these torturous negotiations within which you probably aren't going to have that much impact anyway, and do it and take over. And this is a heretical question for an arms controller, but why don't you just declare that you're not going to have nukes anymore and say you're going to put the money into other concerns which are of greater interest to your voters anyway?
Okay, so who would like to take the question about negotiations between the United Kingdom and other nuclear weapon states?
When do we start?
Okay, well, as far as the UK joining a wider multilateral negotiation about nuclear disarmament, I don't think the opposition party has taken any position on that, but the present government has. Gordon Brown's speech that he made in March at the opening of the conference on civil nuclear energy and a fuel bank was absolutely clear. The answer is we will participate. And he's not been specific about that or what that could mean, but the crucial procurement decisions on Trident have not yet been implemented and are on hold at the moment. It does not mean a change in policy, but it means that nothing irrevocable has happened. If I could answer the second part of your question, try to answer the second part of your question, I think the reason why a unilateral approach to our holding of nuclear weapons is partly British politics, which the two main parties are very firmly, and even the Liberal Democrats are not against the British nuclear deterrent, although they disliked the early stage at which the decision was taken. But it is because we cannot really conceive of a unilateral decision by us having very much impact on anyone, anywhere in the world. It will not make the North Koreans or the Iranians less committed to their programs. It will not affect the Chinese or the Russian or indeed the US approach to this. And frankly, it will not affect the French either, who have taken a number of long-term decisions and are not at the moment in a procurement decision process like we are, because their period in which they have to make decisions came several years ago and they've taken them. So I think our feeling, really, looked at objectively, is it wouldn't make much difference.
Great. Anybody else want to weigh in on why not unilaterally disarm? Yes.
From my perspective, and this word unilateral has much more of a history in our party, Tony, and my party than anywhere else. There's really been an irrelevance to the Conservatives, actually, to be honest. There's never been a unilateralist party, to my knowledge. I hope I'm right, David.
No, absolutely not.
But we were a unilateralist party at one stage. So, I mean, we had long, detailed debates about this in the 80s in particular, I remember.
And in the 60s.
Well, yeah. You can remember the 60s.
If you can't remember the 60s, it's because you were there, isn't it?
Or something like that. But I mean, I've come in my later years to what I recognise as a simplistic view in this, and sometimes I get myself into terrible arguments at home with people about this, but actually, I think, without fear of contradiction, say that all of my political friends are multilateralists. They always were. They were unilateralists because they thought that was the best they could get. You know, we should do it for the reason that is implicit in your question, which is that we give example to others. Actually, all of those people are energised by the current environment, which is why there has been this emergence of multilateralism, particularly in UK politics, because it's multilateralism that we all want. We all want to see these weapons across the world disappear. We're not naive in believing that we will see that in our lifetime, but we want to make a contribution to that, those of us who are in politics, and to drive this agenda forward. And there's a coincidence of factors present at the moment, which we've alluded to, rehearsed, spoken about over the last hour or so, that I won't repeat, that give us some cause for optimism, and or at least create an environment in which we believe we can make a contribution. Now, why don't we just give these weapons up? Well, because there is an intellectual underpinning of what we believe the deterrent effect of these weapons are. There are all sorts of sterile debates about what they don't deter, you know, but they were never designed to deter many of the things that people talk about using them for. I mean, the whole purpose of these weapons, as far as I understand it, and the legal framework in which they can exist in the world that we have all signed up to, is to deter nuclear strikes against us. They are a strategic and political weapon. And our view is that if we live in a multilateral environment in which we need to hold that deterrent, since we cannot uninvent them and we have them, that we ought not to contribute to an environment in which we ask a potential foe to test the willingness of our ally to come to our rescue in that moment of crisis. So if we have them, we're better all getting rid of them together. And in addition, what is the point in a gesture when we believe, and this may be slightly naive, but we believe that with our experience of the last few decades, with our political consensus, and with our connections across the world, that we can make a positive contribution as a member of the club in the P5 to the multilateral disarmament of the world, and we intend to stay there and stay in that. And we do hope, certainly from our perspective in politics, that there will be a next stage after START, as predicted by President Obama in his Prague speech, that the next stage will be one that engages other nuclear weapon countries. I think the second sentence of that paragraph says that. And that was what Gordon Brown was responding to, in my view, in March, when he said we will be there with our weapons in those discussions.
Great. And Tony, you wanted to jump in.
Just really, it's a just a slight addition. I mean, I think it would be inconceivable, actually, both that the UK wouldn't actively want to be at that second round of talks, partly because actually if there is a serious lowering of deployable weapons and weapon systems, then of course actually what we've got becomes more relevant in any case in global terms at some point. But there is another reason, which I think is this. Those discussions, Washington to Moscow discussions, whilst they will focus on strategic nuclear weapons, will also focus on battlefield nuclear weapons. Now, at some point, this question of the imbalance of conventional forces that David Haney referred to earlier on must become part of at least the mood music around those discussions. You cannot discuss nuclear weapons without discussing conventional weapon systems and conventional security. Now, in that sense, Britain being a little bit closer, say, to the Red Army than the United States is, would, at least per force of geography, have some real interest in what was taking place in that overall debate, and I think in actual fact would want to contribute to strongly, not simply in terms of the nuclear weapon systems, but about what the conventional security structures that Europe would be gifted in this process, and actually those in the wider world. So yes, I mean, not only should we be there, we must be there.
Okay. So in the next round of questions, you, sir, and let's get a microphone to you, and then we'll go to you, sir, afterwards, and then we'll do another round.
Excuse me, I'm Dr. Will Curtis from the U.S. Naval Academy, and I think the right number round is probably one I should direct this to. And it has to do with the British, how they, is there a consensus or a British view on the retention of non-strategic nuclear weapons in NATO? And if so, what advantages or disadvantages are perceived to be if those weapons are withdrawn from Europe for European security?
Okay, so that one question for Des, and then you, sir. Just get a microphone to you.
Greg Giles with SAIC. I was wondering if Mr. Lloyd would take a question from his former research assistant.
I think so. It would be unkind to say no, Greg.
If I understood your comments correctly, Iran stands to be a linchpin in the momentum for the NPT review conference, but also for sustaining the need for nuclear deterrence. I was just wondering if you could articulate in more detail your views on whether Iran would, in your view, be able to retain enrichment on its soil. So your views on that, and then the all-party group as well.
Okay. And then why don't we just do one more question from Chris Payne here in the corner, and then we'll get folks going.
Yes. Christopher Payne with the Natural Resources Defense Council. You mentioned that in Britain you've overcome the polarity in the debate between national security and unilateral disarmament. I think you'll discover in this country that we haven't made such progress, and we're still stuck with the equation of the partial measures that you're talking about by arms control opponents as equivalent to unilateral disarmament. And we're seeing that the President Obama actually is rather isolated both within his own government and on Capitol Hill with respect to this disarmament agenda. So I would propose the question for all of you: what can the parliamentary group and the pan-European group, parliamentary group that you were talking about, concretely do in the next few months, particularly at the UN this month, to support the President's agenda? We haven't really seen sort of an organized manifestation of European or allied support for a transformational nuclear weapons agenda that's registered at all with our Congress and with the American public.
Okay. So, Des, you want to take first the question of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm slightly embarrassed to say that I don't think there is a consensus in the United Kingdom on these non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. I suspect that a consensus could emerge very quickly, The reason for my embarrassment is the point I was alluding to earlier. There is no debate about this issue, and has been no recent debate about this issue in the United Kingdom. It is a non-issue as far as the United Kingdom is concerned. I mean, most people in Europe, as I said earlier, don't know these weapons exist in the first place. But most people in Britain don't understand in any event the complex interrelationship between the NATO agreement, the NATO treaty, and the umbrella of nuclear coverage that gives to the other members of NATO, in particular the rest of Europe. I mean, there is, in one view, no non-nuclear weapon state in Europe, because almost all of them rely upon an obligation on the part of the nuclear weapon states who are members of NATO to protect them with their nuclear weapons. So, you know, it was easy for me when I was the defence minister to answer that ridiculous question that people used to ask me, you know, how does the Italian defence minister sleep safe in his bed at night without nuclear weapons? The answer is quite simply because he has ours. And actually, candidly, Europe, and to a degree NATO, disturbs that issue at its peril, because it will create a debate in Europe about these weapons that many politicians will be uncomfortable with. Because many politicians believe that they are leading non-nuclear weapon states, and their countries, you know, their people believe that too, and they don't want to disturb that debate, but we need to disturb it. And in my view, and this is a personal view, this is not, I don't speak for the government any longer, but this view I hold to very strongly, and that is that non-strategic or battlefield nuclear weapons are not legal weapons. I mean, a nuclear weapon can only be, in my view, to be a legal weapon in relation to what we have agreed as civilized nations, how we will conduct ourselves, a strategic weapon, and it can only operate at the highest possible level of threat. So my personal view is we could get rid of these without in any sense undermining our defence or our strategic defence. And the point, of course, that Tony has alluded to and that David has mentioned and that others will debate and discuss is that conventional weapons are much more effective probably for the non-strategic battlefield reasons that these weapons were held originally nowadays, and that conventional forces, which we have a significant superiority of in NATO across the world, despite the difficulties that we are encountering in Afghanistan, would serve that purpose in any event. No part of our security would be in any sense reduced by removing these weapons from where they are presently stored.
Okay. Tony, I'm going to ask you to address the issue of Iran and enrichment, and then, and I'll actually ask both. Great. I'd love for you to comment on that. And then the last question for you to answer is this one about the security disarmament divide and what other states can do to support the president's agenda. So,
David Lidington, in his earliest remarks, made an important point that we have to increase the cost to those who would break out of the NPT treaty. We've got to increase the pressure on those who are would-be proliferators to make sure that, well, where possible, it becomes unthought, and anyway, we increase the level at which it becomes unthinkable. And of course, both Iran and North Korea are the here and nows that if we don't get right, then we go back a long, long way. My own view for a long time has been that if Iran does go nuclear armed, that it's quite likely the pressure for proliferation on its neighbours, on Turkey, on Saudi Arabia, on Egypt will increase in terms of domestic opinion in their own countries, in terms of the logic of local security. None of that's guaranteed, but all of those are reasonable things about which to speculate. So both Iran and North Korea are they're very much here and nows. We do have to be quite clear, though, that one of the deals that the NPT involves is access to civil nuclear technology. And in that sense, Iran has an absolute right, both in international legal terms, but also in terms of common sense, to access to a civil nuclear program. Now, the difficult thing then comes, how far do we trust that process is one that is consistent with with the other. So some of that is about, for example, the insistence that people are signatories to the additional protocol, a much tougher inspection regime, a much tougher level of certainty about what both not simply speculated ambitions are, but actually what reality is doing on the ground, and that would make a difference. In the end, with Iran, can we get to a situation? Because the ideal situation is one where some parts of the nuclear fuel cycle are not domestic, that they are either internationalised or, in any case, that they're held somewhere else, so that Iran doesn't have access to that particular bit of the nuclear progress. Now, within that, is that negotiable? You'll know, I think, that certainly from the European perspective, the Europeans generally put great emphasis on the need to negotiate, and I hope that still is the dominant thought stream post-Iraq here, that there isn't a military solution in Iran, or at least it's not a solution by way of invasion or such like. But I think actually where we square this whole circle is this. Other countries become very important in putting pressure on Iran. Moscow is crucial in putting pressure on Iran. Moscow, in that sense, has to believe that Washington is really serious about this whole nuclear agenda. And the thing that I suppose I would say most strongly to Obama's skeptics in the States is this. How does an American president, any American president, persuade the Russians to be active on Iran unless that Moscow itself can see that Washington is serious about a process, not necessarily of this final goal of a non-nuclear world, but at least a process that lowers the tensions that Moscow face. And a little bit, by the way, the same thing with Beijing. We need Beijing to put some pressure on Tehran, but Moscow, I think, is crucial in this. So if we want to move this agenda on, it's got to be credible, and if it's going to be credible, then the kind of things that your president's talking about now in terms of direct negotiations with Moscow, and also within the context of the CTBT, do become not simply window dressing, these become part of the whole dialogue that allows us to make progress.
Okay, David Lidington.
I think you have to preface anything you say about Iran by acknowledging that no Western government really understands clearly the internal workings of the Iranian regime. It is opaque. I was in Tehran just over a year ago. I mean, on the basis of that visit and sort of what I've read, studied, people I've talked to, I think it's going to be very difficult. I'm more pessimistic now than I was before the presidential election. I had this argument about enrichment with Mr. Safari, who was the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, who was at the Geneva talks. And I said, why do you need enrichment? We got beyond that, it's our sovereign right. Saying, why do you need it? Okay, it's your sovereign right. Why do you need it? The Russians are supplying you with the fuel for Bush here. That's the only reactor which you need reprocessed fuel. And he looked at me straight in the eye and he said, well, would you trust the Russians with your energy security? I mean, these people, they're not fools. They're canny, they're clever, and they have a very clear-eyed and hard-headed view of their national interest. And I think that there is a near universal support within Iran, certainly including Mousavi and Karoubi, for Iran to have a civil nuclear program. Can they be pushed off it? I hope so, but I think that the failure of some European countries, as well as Russia and China, to come up with the goods on effective sanctions have made that a lot more difficult. I think that while we must continue that sort of pressure, I think it may be possible, the Iranians might be induced to accept an enriched bank under international supervision, but on their soil. I think what they said to me was that it has to be on our soil, not somewhere abroad. But we would look at international supervision or ownership of it on our soil. That was 12 months ago. Whether it's the same now, I don't know. Beyond that, let's say they get to control of the fuel cycle, but they don't actually test a weapon or announce that they've got a weapon there, but everybody thinks that they have breakout within their grasp if they chose to go down that path. Could you put in a series of checks and quick and effective sanctions to deter any Iranian leader from going from control of the fuel cycle to having a weapon? And going beyond that, if we're looking at the prospect of a nuclear Iran, I hope that there is some serious secret contingency planning going on in Washington and elsewhere about what you do in those circumstances, not just sanctions to isolate Iran from the world economy. There are already half-mile queues outside petrol stations and 4-hour planned power cuts every day in Tehran. But what sort of security guarantees would other countries in the region require if they were to be dissuaded from going down the nuclear weapons route themselves? As my biggest fear is if people believe Iran has that capability, then Saudi, Egypt, perhaps Turkey, perhaps the UAE will be very, very sorely tempted to go down the same route.
Right. As we're near the end of our time, David Henning, I'm going to give you the last question, which is about the security disarmament divide and what can be done to support the president's agenda.
Yes. Well, it's not an easy question to answer convincingly because the answer lies, of course, within the United States body politic, effectively. It is whether the president gets broad support, not only for what he said at Prague, but for the individual elements of that, for the next stage of beyond that, for the CTBT ratification, for the Fissile Material Cut-Off Treaty, for action to strengthen the IAEA, and so on. But what we can do, and what I think we are already doing, but it's probably not as visible as it ought to, and hopefully this visit here is just one tiny little piece in the mosaic to show that there is very strong support out there for the agenda he has set out. And I do think it needs to be remembered that the very strong improvement in America's standing in the world that has taken place since President Obama was sworn into office, which I think is an incontrovertible fact borne out by any number of opinion polls and so on, depends quite a bit for what he's done in this area. And if that was rendered inoperative, to use a phrase, then that would weaken this shift back towards working with the United States for multilateral solutions. So it would be, in my view, to the detriment of the United States too. But we've got to do more, clearly, in supporting that agenda and in coming to the table and in negotiating in all these areas in a reasonable, flexible way, and that's a huge challenge for the years ahead. 2010, we're all focused on the Non-Proliferation Review Conference, but of course it's only one milestone in a much, much longer road than that. It needs to be got right because it needs to demonstrate that the sense that the direction of travel has changed, that we're no longer deconstructing multilateral disarmament, we're actually building it up brick by brick. But, of course, not all that much, to be realistic, will have been achieved by May of next year, and the agenda will roll on for a long, long way beyond that if it is to be effective, and we will have to play a role. But the American role is very critical, as I said in a previous answer. It is something without which we're not going to get anywhere.
Great, thank you, and I think that's exactly the right note to end on. This conversation, I think, really highlights how much we have to learn from the United Kingdom's experience with these issues, and hopefully jointly together we can all make a lot more progress towards shared aspirational goals. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel.